This seat was the one thing he'd finally earned for his son, until someone decided it wasn't his anymore. He didn't argue. He just held his son's hand a little tighter and kept walking. 5 minutes before takeoff, a phone call from the right person made his seat disappear.
Excuse me, sir. I'm terribly sorry, but there's been a change.
You heard her. Get out of my seat. He noticed the one detail nobody else on that plane was trained to catch. Can I help you, sir?
Malik Turner had spent an entire year collecting airline miles one small trip at a time, skipping the extra coffee, driving the long way to avoid tolls, doing anything he could to scrape together enough points for a single business class upgrade a euro, not for himself, but for his 8-year-old son, Jaden, who had never once in his life sat anywhere but the very back of a plane. If you've ever worked hard for something small and had someone with more money simply take it from you, stay with this story until the end of Euro, and if it resonates, hit like and subscribe because Malik's story isn't finished at the moment you think it is. Malik was a single father raising Jaden alone since his wife Denise passed away from a sudden illness 3 years earlier. He worked as a facilities technician for a regional shipping company, a steady but unglamorous job that let him structure his life around his son's school schedule, and in the evenings, he picked up freelance security consulting shifts using skills he'd built during a 6-year stint as an Air Force Security Forces specialist before Jaden was even born. Almost nobody in his current life knew much about that old career. He didn't talk about it often. He'd built a quieter version of himself around fatherhood, and the only part of his old training he still carried with him was a habit he couldn't quite shake: a constant, almost involuntary awareness of exits, of who was sitting where, of what didn't belong in a room. He'd tried to leave that instinct behind along with the uniform. It never fully left him. This trip had been a year in the making. Jaden had been asking, gently and persistently, whether they could someday fly in the big seats, up front, like on TV, and Malik had promised him that for his 9th birthday, they would. He'd saved every mile, called in every loyalty bonus, and finally, 2 weeks before the trip, the confirmation email arrived: Seat 2A, business class, flight 512 to Atlanta. He'd read it out loud to Jaden 3 times just to watch his son's face light up each time. The morning of the flight, they arrived at the airport 2 hours early, Jaden practically vibrating with excitement in his small gray hoodie, clutching a rolled-up airplane magazine he'd already read twice. They checked in, breezed through the priority security line for the first time in their lives, and made their way to the gate, where the agent smiled warmly and told them boarding would begin shortly. Malik let himself feel, for the first time in longer than he could remember, like things were finally going right. They boarded early, found seat 2A and 2 billions, and settled in. Jaden immediately reached for the little amenity kit in the seat pocket, turning it over in his hands like it was a piece of treasure. Malik watched him and felt something in his chest loosen, some old tightness he'd been carrying since Denise died, easing just slightly. This was what he'd worked for. Not the seat itself, a euro. The look on his son's face. 5 minutes before the doors were scheduled to close, a flight attendant approached, flanked awkwardly by a gate supervisor. Malik looked up, already sensing something was wrong before either of them spoke. "Mr. Turner," the flight attendant said, her voice apologetic but firm, "I'm so sorry, but there's been a seating conflict. We need you and your son to move to seats 34C and 34D. Ah! Malik blinked. There's no conflict. This is our confirmed seat. I have the confirmation right here. He held up his phone, the email still open. Behind the flight attendant, a tall man in a tailored dark blue suit stood. In the aisle with his arms crossed, silver hair combed back, an expression of mild, practiced impatience on his face. Euro, the kind of impatience that came from a lifetime of never having to wait for anything. This was Gerald Whitfield, a name Malik didn't recognize but would come to understand. Meant something to the airline's regional management, a name attached to a corporate account that funneled enough revenue through the airline each year that a phone call from him carried more weight than a confirmed reservation from anyone else. There's been an override, the gate supervisor said quietly, not quite meeting Malik's eyes. "Mr. Whitfield's assistant contacted us this morning. We upgraded him into this row. I really am sorry, sir." Malik looked at Jaden, whose excitement had drained into confused silence, still holding the little amenity kit like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to keep it anymore. Malik felt the old anger rise, sharp and immediate, the kind he used to have to control constantly in his old job. He didn't raise his voice. He'd learned a long time ago that raising your voice in an airport got you escorted off a plane, not respected. He simply looked at the supervisor and said, "You're taking a paid, confirmed seat from a child to give it to a man who called this morning." "I understand your frustration," the supervisor said, clearly rehearsing a line she'd been given. "But we do need you to relocate now, or we'll have to hold the flight." Malik stood, gathered their bags, and took Jaden's hand. He didn't look at Gerald Whitfield as he passed him in the aisle, though he felt the man's eyes on him the entire way, faintly amused, entirely unbothered. A few passengers in the front rows glanced up as they walked past, that particular kind of airport pity that somehow makes a humiliation feel even more complete. Malik kept his face calm. He squeezed Jaden's hand a little tighter and walked them both back to row 34. "Dad," Jaden whispered once they sat down, "did we do something wrong?" "No, buddy," Malik said, forcing his voice to stay light. "Sometimes grown-ups with more money get to skip lines. It's not fair, but it's not about you." He meant it as comfort. It didn't feel like comfort saying it out loud. What Malik didn't mention to his son, because there was no reason to yet, was that some old instinct in him had already shifted focus the moment he sat down in Coincidental, not toward his own frustration, but outward, scanning, the way he used to before every deployment briefing in his old career. Something about the exchange at the gate had felt off in a way that had nothing to do with fairness. Whitfield's assistant had called that morning, hours before boarding, to secure a specific seat, €1, not an upgrade request, a very specific override on a very specific row. Malik had spent 6 years learning to notice when something was engineered rather than convenient, and this had the shape of something engineered. He kept half an eye on the front of the cabin as the last passengers boarded. He watched Whitfield settle into seat 2, €, Malik seat €, and stow a black leather bag beneath the seat in front of him instead of in the overhead bin, an unusual choice for a man clearly used to first-class service, where cabin crew typically handled luggage placement without being asked. He watched Whitfield check his watch 3 times in the span of a few minutes, glancing toward the cabin door each time. The small, repetitive motion of someone waiting for a specific signal, rather than simply passing time. Malik told himself he was being paranoid, a habit left over from a life he no longer lived. He almost let it go. Then he saw the flight attendant walk past seat 2 twice without Whitfield acknowledging her at all, both times seeming to deliberately angle his body to block her view of the space beneath his seat. Malik unbuckled his seatbelt. "Stay right here, Jaden, I'll be right back," he said quietly, and made his way up the aisle before the flight attendant reached the galley, catching her arm gently. "I used to work security for the Air Force," Malik said quietly, low enough that only she could hear. "The passenger in 2A has checked his watch 3 times and watched that door every 90 seconds since he sat down, and he's deliberately blocking visibility of a bag he insisted on keeping under his own seat instead of letting your crew handle it. I could be wrong, but I don't think I am." The flight attendant's expression shifted from polite confusion to something sharper. She'd been trained for exactly this kind of moment, even if she'd never actually lived through one. She thanked him quietly and moved toward the cockpit door. What happened over the next 5 minutes happened fast. The captain made a calm, practiced announcement that, due to a security matter, all passengers would need to leave the aircraft immediately and in an orderly fashion, leaving personal items behind for inspection. Confusion rippled through the cabin. Passengers stood, murmuring, gathering children and bags despite the instruction, flight attendants moving briskly up and down the aisle repeating the same steady phrase, "Please proceed calmly to the nearest exit." Malik scooped up Jaden, held him close, and moved with the crowd toward the rear exit, watching as airport security boarded through the front of the aircraft the moment the last passengers cleared it. Gerald Whitfield was escorted off separately, flanked by 2 officers, his earlier composure entirely gone, his voice rising in protest as he was walked down a side corridor away from the main terminal. It turned out, as investigators pieced together over the following hours, that the bag beneath seat 2A contained undeclared, improperly secured cargo tied to an ongoing customs investigation into Whitfield's export business nothing explosive, nothing meant to harm anyone directly, but a serious enough security and customs violation that federal protocol required an immediate full evacuation and inspection the moment it was flagged. Whitfield hadn't planned an attack. He'd simply believed, correctly for most of his life, that enough money and enough phone calls could move any obstacle out of his way, including the law. The seat swap that morning hadn't been random cruelty. It had been strategic. He'd wanted the row closest to the door, the one with the most direct, least monitored access, and he'd been willing to displace a child to get it. Malik and Jaden sat together on a bench in the terminal for the next 2 hours while the aircraft was cleared, giving a full statement to airport security officials who, upon hearing his former role, treated him with a level of respect that felt strange after the morning he'd had. An airline regional manager found them an hour later, visibly mortified, apologizing repeatedly, explaining that Whitfield's account had been suspended pending investigation and that the seat swap should never have been approved in the first place. "You have no idea what you just prevented from becoming a much bigger story," the manager said quietly. "I just noticed something that didn't sit right," Malik said. "That's all." They were reboarded 3 hours later on a replacement aircraft, and this time, without Malik asking for anything, the airline placed him and Jaden in seats 2A and 2B, the actual seats they'd paid for from the start, along with a formal letter of apology and a credit toward future travel that Malik quietly folded into his jacket pocket without much interest. He hadn't done any of it for a free seat. He'd done it because some habits, some instincts built from years of paying attention when it mattered, never really leave you, even after you've built an entirely different, quieter life around them. Jaden fell asleep an hour into the actual flight, head resting against his father's shoulder, the little amenity kit still clutched in one hand. Malik looked down at him, at the seat they should have had all along, and felt something settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the upgrade at all. By the time they landed in Atlanta, the story had already started circulating. A passenger recognized Malik's face from an airport security bulletin quietly shared online, and within 2 days, local news picked it up. Then national outlets, all running some version of the same headline, the single dad who got bumped from his own paid seat, and 5 minutes later ended up being the reason an entire flight full of passengers went home safe. Malik never sought the attention. He gave one brief interview, mostly to make clear that any praise belonged equally to the flight crew who trusted a stranger's instinct over a wealthy man's comfort, and then he quietly went back to being exactly who he was before any of it happened. A father, working hard, saving up for the next small thing his son wanted. If there's a message worth carrying out of this one, it's this: the person you dismiss, displace, or talk over because they don't look important enough to matter might be the only one in the room actually paying attention. Money can buy a better seat. It has never once been able to buy the kind of quiet attention that actually keeps people safe.